The city stretched before her like a sea of endless opportunity and ruthless ambition. The Manhattan skyline glittered under the weight of 1,000 untold stories, but Eleanor Hayes was never one to let fate write hers. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse suite, watching the city move beneath her like a chessboard, every piece carefully placed, every move calculated. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the faint ticking of the Rolex on her wrist, a reminder that time was always against her. Tomorrow, the world would be watching. The International Economic Summit in Paris wasn't just another conference. It was the kind of battlefield where fortunes were made or shattered, where power wasn't just a currency. It was everything. And Eleanor? She was on the brink of securing the biggest merger of her career, one that could position her as the most formidable force in the financial world. But just as she allowed herself a moment to bask in the gravity of what was to come, her phone vibrated sharply against the glass table beside her. A message. Urgent. Her assistant's name flashed on the screen. Kara. There's been a problem with your suite in Paris. Major error. You're not going to like this. Eleanor exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the stem of her untouched glass of wine. Problem? There was no room for problems. Not now? She typed back swiftly. Eleanor. Fix it. Whatever it takes. Kara. Tried. The hotel is at full capacity. She paused at the 3 dots blinking on the screen. Then the message came. Kara. Sharing a suite. With Noah Sinclair. The name hit like a blade to the ribs. The wine glass trembled slightly in her grip before she set it down, her breath steady, measured. But inside, a storm raged. Noah Sinclair. Her rival. Her enemy. The one man who had spent the last 5 years making her life a calculated hell in the financial world. Every deal, every investment, every strategic move she made. He was there, blocking her, matching her, challenging her. If she secured a major tech acquisition, Noah would drive up the price. If she entered a market, he'd find a way to sabotage it. If she built an empire, he'd build one just as strong. The tension between them was legendary, cold, unspoken, dangerously electric. Eleanor had always played by the rules she created, rules she mastered. But Noah? He was chaos in a 3-piece suit, and now she was trapped with him for an entire week. The thought alone made her stomach coil with unease. She turned sharply from the window, grabbing her suitcase and heading for the elevator. She would fix this herself. The first thing Eleanor noticed about the Grand Versailles Hotel was the sheer opulence. The towering chandeliers cast a golden glow over marble floors, the air thick with the scent of luxury and exclusivity. But none of it mattered. Not when she stepped up to the reception desk and heard a voice behind her. Low, smooth, infuriatingly familiar. They say Paris is the city of love, Eleanor. Are we celebrating something I wasn't aware of? She froze for half a second. Not because she was surprised. Noah Sinclair never surprised her. But because his voice, that deep, maddening, arrogant voice, had always had a way of slipping under her skin, like silk and steel woven into one. Taking a steady breath, she turned. And there he was. Noah Sinclair. Tall, effortlessly commanding, dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit his lean, powerful frame like a second skin. His piercing blue eyes swept over her, calculating, knowing, as if already amused by whatever reaction he was about to provoke. God, she hated him. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. They also say Paris is the city of tragedy. You might want to keep that in mind. Noah chuckled. A low, rich sound that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. You wound me, Hayes, he murmured, and here I was thinking this would be the start of something. Beautiful. Eleanor clenched her jaw. He was enjoying this. Of course he was. She turned back to the receptionist, her voice cool and professional. "This must be a mistake. I booked the presidential suite." The receptionist gave a nervous smile. "Yes, Ms. Hayes, and Mr. Sinclair had the royal suite. Unfortunately, due to a system failure, there was a double booking. With the summit bringing in record attendance, we are at full capacity." Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. She exhaled slowly. "Then fix it." "We've tried, but I'm afraid—" A soft chuckle came from beside her. She didn't have to turn to know Noah was smirking. And then, he leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "What's the matter, Eleanor?" The warmth of his breath skimmed her ear, sending an unwelcome rush of heat through her veins. "Afraid you won't be able to handle me?" She turned to him, her sharp gaze meeting his head-on. "I handle billion-dollar deals for breakfast, Sinclair. You? You're nothing more than an inconvenience." His smirk deepened, a slow, deliberate thing. "An inconvenience you'll be sharing a bed with, apparently." Eleanor stiffened, her lips parted. A sharp retort at the ready. But before she could speak, the receptionist quickly interjected. Not the same bed, of course not. The suite has separate rooms, separate facilities." She trailed off awkwardly. Noah let out a mock sigh of disappointment. Eleanor shot him a glare that could have melted glass. With a slow, resigned breath, she turned back to the receptionist, her voice ice-cold. "Fine." She grabbed the keycard from the counter, turned on her heel, and walked away without another word. But as she strode toward the elevator, her heart pounding in her chest, she made one silent, unshakable vow. She would not let him get to her. Not this time, not ever. But as Noah followed behind her, his gaze heavy on her back, she had the strangest feeling that this week would change everything. And that terrified her more than anything else. The elevator ride to the presidential suite stretched longer than it should have. Silence wrapped around them. Not the comfortable kind, but the thick, heavy kind, humming with unspoken words and sharp tension. Eleanor Hayes stood with her arms crossed, her posture impeccable, her spine straight as if bracing for battle. She refused to acknowledge the man standing next to her. Noah Sinclair. His presence was impossible to ignore. He leaned against the elevator wall with that same insufferable ease, his hands tucked in his pockets, his crisp suit slightly unbuttoned, an intentional act of calculated carelessness. Eleanor hated it, hated how effortlessly he seemed to exist in her space, hated how he was watching her now, his piercing blue eyes dragging over her profile, not with curiosity, but with something far more dangerous. A game. And she refused to play it. The moment the elevator chimed and the doors slid open, she stepped forward with purpose, heels clicking against the gleaming marble hallway. Noah followed at his own pace, too relaxed, too composed, as if he found the entire situation highly amusing. They reached the double doors of the suite. Eleanor swiped the keycard, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. Then stopped dead in her tracks. Because, of course, the suite was as luxurious as expected, a sprawling expanse of polished wood floors, glass walls offering a breathtaking view of the Eiffel Tower, a fully stocked bar glimmering under soft golden lighting. But the problem? The so-called separate quarters were far from separate. Yes, 2 bedrooms, but they were connected by one dangerously intimate space, a shared living area, a shared study, and a shared tension that had already filled the room. Eleanor exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temple. Unbelievable. Behind her, the door clicked shut. Noah took his time stepping inside, letting his gaze roam lazily over the suite before settling on her. And then, he smirked. Cozy, isn't it? She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. You're enjoying this, aren't you? He let out a low chuckle, shrugging out of his jacket and tossing it onto the back of a chair. Let's just say, I don't mind watching you unravel. Eleanor stiffened. Unravel. The word coiled around her like a silent dare. She took a measured breath, schooling her expression into something cool and indifferent. This is temporary, she said smoothly, stepping toward the bar, putting distance between them. I don't care if we're forced to share a space. Just stay out of my way. Noah leaned against the edge of the leather sofa, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. That's going to be difficult, he mused, considering you can't seem to ignore me. Eleanor's grip tightened around the edge of the marble counter. He was baiting her. And damn it, it was working. She turned, meeting his gaze head-on, refusing to let him see the way his presence made her pulse race. You overestimate your importance, Sinclair. Noah pushed off the sofa, closing the distance between them in a few slow steps. Too close. Do I? The air between them shifted. She could smell the faintest hint of his cologne. Something dark, something expensive, something that irritated her because it suited him perfectly. He was testing her, trying to see if she'd crack. So she refused to move. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. You really think I'm that easy to rattle? Noah studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver flask, popped the cap, took a slow sip, and then held it out to her. Drink? Eleanor arched an eyebrow. What is this? A peace offering? More like a test. She crossed her arms. A test for what? To see if you're actually as fearless as you pretend to be. The challenge in his voice sent a spark through her veins. Oh, Sinclair. She took the flask without hesitation, raising it to her lips without breaking eye contact. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The whiskey burned down her throat, smooth, rich, laced with fire, much like the man in front of her. She handed the flask back, their fingers grazing for just a fraction of a second. A moment so quick, so fleeting, yet the heat from it spread like wildfire. Noah smirked. Interesting. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. You're playing a dangerous game, Sinclair. Noah leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down her spine. And yet you haven't walked away. She could feel the heat of his breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on them, wrapping around them like an unspoken confession. The unspoken truth that this, whatever this was no longer just about business. But before either of them could say another word, the hotel phone rang. Sharp, loud, intrusive. Eleanor blinked, breaking eye contact, turning toward the desk. The spell shattered. She strode over, picking up the receiver. Hayes. A pause. Then, Ms. Hayes, there's been a change in the schedule. Your panel discussion has been moved up. You'll be presenting tomorrow morning instead of Friday. Eleanor inhaled slowly. This was the most critical pitch of her career, the deal of a lifetime. And now she had less than 24 hours to prepare. Understood, she said, hanging up. She turned back toward Noah, her mind already spinning through strategies, only to find him watching her, like he knew exactly what had just happened, like he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. And then, he smirked. Looks like you've got some work to do, Eleanor. Her eyes narrowed. She would not let him win. Not here, not now, not ever. She turned toward her room, gripping the doorknob with more force than necessary. Stay out of my way, Sinclair. She slammed the door behind her. Noah exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. He picked up the flask again, took another slow sip, and murmured to himself, "Oh, Eleanor, you're making this far too fun." And with that, he leaned back against the sofa, because he knew this was only the beginning. Eleanor slammed the bedroom door behind her, pressing her back against it as if she could somehow shut out his presence, his words, his gaze, the way he managed to get under her skin with a mere smirk. Her hands curled into fists. He's insufferable, arrogant, infuriating. But the worst part? She had almost let herself fall into his game. That damn flask, that challenge in his voice, the way their fingers had brushed, sending a current through her that she had no business feeling. "Control yourself, Hayes." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, willing her heart to slow its traitorous rhythm. She didn't have time for distractions, especially not the kind that came in the form of Noah Sinclair. The hours ticked by, but sleep never came. Eleanor sat at the sleek glass desk in her room, laptop open, reports scattered across the surface. The soft glow from the bedside lamp illuminated her face, but her mind wasn't focused on the words in front of her. Her pitch, the most important presentation of her career, had been moved up to tomorrow morning. That meant less than 12 hours to ensure that everything was airtight. Yet, despite the urgency, her thoughts kept drifting. To the other side of the suite. To him. She could hear faint sounds through the walls, a low murmur of movement, the clink of a glass against the bar counter. Was he still awake? Did it even matter? She tried to ignore it, to push away the awareness creeping into her bones. Until a knock at her door. Sharp. Decisive. Him. Her pulse spiked. For a second, she considered ignoring it. Then, before she could stop herself, she stood and crossed the room, opening the door just enough to see him standing there, tousled, casual, and far too composed for this hour. "Sinclair." Her voice was neutral, unaffected, or at least she tried to make it so. Noah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. His sleeves were still rolled up from earlier, the first few buttons of his shirt undone, and there was something almost lazy about the way he looked at her. Except his eyes. His eyes were sharp, focused. "I was wondering," he said, voice low, "how long you were going to sit here and pretend you weren't drowning." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me?" Noah gestured toward the desk behind her, where stacks of documents sat untouched, and the laptop screen flickered with spreadsheets she wasn't even looking at. "You're overthinking, overworking, staring at a screen instead of sleeping. And considering you're about to walk into a room full of investors tomorrow, I'd say that's a problem." Eleanor scoffed, crossing her arms. "I don't need your concern, Sinclair." "That's good," he said smoothly, stepping inside as if he had every right to. "Because I'm not concerned. I just don't want you tanking your own presentation and making my job too easy." Eleanor glared. "Out." No, her patience snapped. "What do you want?" Noah tilted his head slightly. "To help." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Right. Help. That's rich, coming from you." But he didn't smile, didn't look amused anymore. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice steady, "you and I both know you need a second set of eyes, and I happen to be the only person in this entire building who's on your level." She opened her mouth, to argue, to push him away, to deny that he was right. But then, he reached for her laptop, and she let him. She told herself it was practicality, that accepting his help wasn't a sign of weakness, just strategy. But as he pulled up a chair, sitting close enough that she could feel the heat of him, she wasn't so sure. The sun had barely risen over Paris when Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the final button on her sleek black blazer. She should have been laser-focused on her presentation, on the numbers, the projections, the billions at stake. Instead, Her mind betrayed her. It kept circling back to last night, to the way Noah's fingers had brushed against her wrist, lingering just long enough to send her pulse into chaos, to the way he'd looked at her, not like a rival, not like an enemy, but like something else entirely, something far more dangerous. Eleanor clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply. No, she refused to be distracted. Noah Sinclair was a problem she'd deal with later. Right now, she had a room full of the most powerful investors in the world waiting for her, and she did not intend to lose. The showdown at the summit. The conference hall was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in cold, golden morning light. Every major player in global finance was here. Investors, CEOs, industry titans. And at the head of the room, facing them all, her Eleanor adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and stepped forward. Calm, composed, unshakable, this was her world. She lived for the high stakes, the silent anticipation, the moment before she took control of the room. With practiced ease, she began her pitch. Numbers, data, market trends. Her voice was smooth, every word precise, every detail carefully crafted to drive her point home. She could feel the weight of their attention, their interest sharpening. Until a voice cut through the silence, deep, smooth, and utterly infuriating. "Ms. Hayes, let's talk risk assessment." Eleanor's pulse spiked before she even turned towards the voice. But she knew. Of course, she knew. Noah Sinclair, seated right at the front, legs crossed, an air of calculated indifference about him. His crisp white shirt was unbuttoned just enough to look effortless, his jacket draped over the chair as if he owned the room. And the look in his eyes? A challenge. Eleanor didn't flinch. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "I assume you have a point, Sinclair?" Her tone was cool, polished, but beneath it, her blood was already burning. Noah smirked. "Of course, it's a compelling presentation, Eleanor. Really, it is. But tell me." He leaned forward, his voice dropping just slightly. "If this is such a foolproof investment, why is your risk margin questionable at best?" A murmur rippled through the audience, eyes shifted between them, watching, waiting. This wasn't just a presentation anymore. This was a public battlefield, and Noah had just fired the first shot. Eleanor didn't blink. If you'd been paying attention, you'd know the projected risk margin is already accounted for within our liquidity model. She turned slightly, giving the audience a polished, effortless smile. "Of course, I understand that some prefer playing it safe rather than actually leading." The insinuation was clear. Noah played defense, Eleanor played offense, and she was winning. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the room. But Noah? Oh, he was enjoying this. A slow, deliberate smile curved his lips. "So, what you're saying," he mused, tapping his fingers against the table, "is that this entire venture hinges on you being right." Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. "That's the difference between us, Sinclair." She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to match his. "I don't need to be right. I just need to be smarter." Silence. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Noah's expression. Something dark, something dangerous. Then, slowly, so damn slowly, he smirked. "Careful, Eleanor." His voice was quiet, but there was a warning beneath it. "You're getting cocky." She tilted her head. "I don't get cocky, Sinclair. I get results." And with that, she turned away because this game she had already won. She had. The moment the panel ended, Eleanor strode out of the conference hall, her pulse still thrumming from the tension, the adrenaline, the sheer electricity of it all. She had shut Noah Sinclair down in front of the most powerful people in the industry. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt restless. Damn him. Damn his stupid smirk. Damn the way every nerve in her body had come alive the second he challenged her. Eleanor exhaled sharply, rounding the corner towards the elevators, only to stop dead in her tracks. Because there he was, waiting for her. Noah leaned casually against the elevator wall, watching her approach with an expression that was infuriatingly unreadable. She should have walked past him, should have ignored him, but her feet stopped on their own. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Noah let out a low chuckle. "You enjoyed that?" Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You're delusional." He pushed off the wall, stepping closer. Too close. Close enough that she could smell the faint, clean spice of his cologne. Close enough that his voice dropped just for her. "You love it." Her breath hitched. "What exactly do you think I love, Sinclair?" Noah's lips curled. Just slightly. "The fight." Eleanor didn't move. Couldn't, because the worst part, the part she would never admit. He was right. She was drowning in it. And God help her, she didn't want to come up for air. The elevator doors slid open behind her, but she didn't step inside. Neither did he. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something dangerous. Noah tilted his head slightly, watching her too carefully. "Tell me I'm wrong," her throat tightened. Tell him, say the words, lie, but she didn't, because she couldn't. And Noah saw it. He saw everything. A slow, knowing smirk pulled at his lips. Then, without another word, he stepped into the elevator. And as the doors slid shut between them, locking them in a war neither of them knew how to end, Eleanor realized something. This game, it had never been about winning. It had always been about them. And that was far more dangerous than anything she had ever faced before. The moment Noah Sinclair knocked on her door, Eleanor knew. She knew this wasn't just a game anymore. It wasn't just rivalry or tension or the thrill of the challenge. It was something else, something that terrified her. And yet, she still opened the door. Noah leaned against the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her. His tie was gone. The top few buttons of his shirt were undone. And there was something unreadable in his eyes. Something she had never seen before. Not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in the heated debates that always ended with one of them walking away victorious. This was different, and she didn't know how to fight it. "Can't sleep?" he asked, voice lower than usual. Eleanor crossed her arms. "Neither can you." He didn't deny it. Instead, he studied her for a long moment before stepping inside. Slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to stop him. She didn't. The door clicked shut behind him. A choice was made, and now there was no going back. They stood too close, the air between them humming with something undeniable. Eleanor exhaled, arms still crossed. "What do you want, Sinclair?" Noah tilted his head slightly. "Isn't it obvious?" She swallowed. "No." And for the first time, he didn't smirk, didn't tease, didn't try to win. Instead, he stepped closer, just a fraction. "I think we both know what this is." His voice was quiet, careful. "And I think we've known for a while." Eleanor's chest tightened, because he was right. She had felt it in every heated glance, every lingering touch, every argument that made her pulse race in ways it shouldn't. But saying it aloud, admitting it, that was dangerous. So instead she whispered, "This is a bad idea." Noah chuckled softly, eyes never leaving hers. "Yeah, the worst." Neither of them moved, neither of them stepped away. And then, his fingers brushed against hers, a small, fleeting touch, barely anything. But it sent a sharp jolt through her system, setting every nerve on fire. Her breath hitched. Noah saw it, felt it. And this time, he didn't hold back. Slowly, deliberately, He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The warmth of his fingers lingered against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Eleanor should have stopped him, should have stepped back. But instead, she leaned in. Just slightly. Just enough that she could feel his breath against her lips. Just enough that he whispered, soft, wrecked. "Tell me to stop." Her pulse pounded. Her body screamed at her to close the distance, but instead, she whispered back, "I can't." And that was all it took. Noah moved first. Not rushed. Not reckless. Just intentional. Like he had been waiting for this moment longer than either of them wanted to admit. His hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her just close enough to feel the heat of him. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't demanding. It was slow, intense, a silent confession in the dark. Eleanor's fingers curled into his shirt, holding on like she was afraid to let go. And maybe she was, because this wasn't just attraction. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was something real, something terrifyingly real. And when they finally broke apart, both breathless, both shaken, Noah's forehead rested against hers. His voice was rough, unsteady for the first time ever. "What now?" Eleanor exhaled, her fingers still gripping him, as if letting go meant losing everything. She closed her eyes. And then, she made her choice. She whispered, soft but certain, "We don't stop." Noah smiled against her skin, good, and then he kissed her again. This time she didn't hesitate. This time she kissed him back. The camera zooms out as they move in sync, the Paris skyline glowing outside the window, soft whispers, desperate touches, the moment they finally surrender. Because some things were never meant to be fought. Some things were meant to be felt. And this was one of them. The world outside didn't exist. The walls of the suite, the quiet hum of the city, the golden glow of Paris beyond the window. None of it mattered. Because in this moment, it was just them. Just the slow burn of a rivalry that had turned into something neither of them had been prepared for. Something too intense to control, too real to deny. Eleanor pressed her palms against Noah's chest, her breath unsteady against his lips. She should have pulled away, should have stepped back, taken a second to think. But she couldn't, because Noah was looking at her differently now. Not like a competitor, not like a challenge, but like a man who had been fighting this just as hard as she had. And now, they had both lost. Or maybe they had won. Noah's hand slid lower, fingers pressing into the small of her back. His voice was husky, rough. "Tell me to stop, Eleanor." She didn't even hesitate. Instead, she whispered, soft, wrecked, "I don't want you to." A quiet curse escaped his lips. And then, he kissed her again. This time it was different. It wasn't careful, it wasn't slow. It was a collision, hot, breathless, inevitable. His hands mapped every inch of her, memorizing the curve of her spine, the dip of her waist. And Eleanor let him. Because tonight she wasn't a CEO. She wasn't a strategist. She wasn't fighting to win. She was just a woman, falling, crashing, unraveling, and Noah was the only thing keeping her grounded. At some point they ended up on the bed, sheets tangled around them, the city lights casting shadows on their skin. Eleanor's fingers traced the sharp edge of Noah's jawline, watching the way his breath hitched under her touch. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, and for the first time all night, she felt something tighten in her chest. Something that had nothing to do with desire. Something much, much worse, because this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a night they would forget in the morning. This was something more, something dangerous. Noah must have felt it too, because his next kiss wasn't desperate, it was slow, deep, lingering, like he was memorizing her, like he knew this moment wasn't just passion. It was a turning point, a before and after, a moment that would change everything. When it was over, they didn't move. Eleanor lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Noah was beside her, one arm slung lazily across his forehead, but his breathing wasn't steady either. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "That was," Eleanor started, but the words died in her throat. Because how the hell was she supposed to describe this? A mistake? No, a disaster? Maybe, but also undeniable. Noah turned his head toward her. "Yeah, just one word." But the way he said it, like he knew, like he felt it too, like they were both completely, hopelessly screwed. Because there was no pretending after this. No going back. No erasing what had just happened. And the worst part? Neither of them wanted to. The first thing Eleanor felt was warmth. The soft heat of a body pressed against hers. The steady rise and fall of breath at the back of her neck. For a moment, just one fleeting second, she let herself sink into it, into the quiet, into the comfort, into the feeling of being held. But then, reality crashed in, her eyes snapped open. What the hell did I do? She shifted slightly, just enough to confirm what she already knew. Noah, still asleep, still in her bed, and worse, still wrapped around her like he belonged there. Her pulse spiked, panic creeping up her spine. This was not how it was supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a moment of weakness, a mistake they would pretend never happened. But this? This was something else, something too intimate, too dangerous. She needed to get out. Carefully, so damn carefully, Eleanor untangled herself from him, slipping out of bed without waking him. Her clothes were scattered on the floor. The memories of last night, hot, breathless, undeniable, hit her all at once. She squeezed her eyes shut, shoving the thoughts away as she grabbed her dress. She just needed to get dressed, just needed to leave before... Running away already? Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. Noah was awake now, bare-chested, leaning up on one elbow, watching her. But his usual smirk? Nowhere to be found. There was something else in his eyes. Something undeniable, something dangerous. Eleanor swallowed hard. This was a mistake. Noah studied her for a long, tense moment. Then, he sat up. Is that what we're calling it? His voice was quiet. Low. Too calm. Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze. Yes. A beat of silence. Then, he nodded. All right. His tone was unreadable, detached. But his eyes? His eyes told a different story. They were darker now, sharper. And for the first time since she had met him, Eleanor couldn't tell what he was thinking. She grabbed her clutch, forcing herself to stay in control. To act like this was just another transaction, another business deal. No emotions, no complications. She was Eleanor Hayes. She did not fall for men like Noah Sinclair. And she sure as hell didn't wake up feeling something. But as she reached for the door handle, his voice stopped her. Eleanor. Her breath caught. She turned. He was still sitting on the bed, looking at her with that same unreadable expression. And then, softly, "Tell me you don't feel it." Her heart stopped. A war raged inside her, logic versus desire. She wanted to lie, to tell him she felt nothing, but the words refused to come, because they both knew the truth. Eleanor swallowed. It doesn't matter. Noah's jaw clenched slightly, but he nodded. If you say so. And just like that, he let her go. The second Eleanor stepped out of his suite, she pulled in a sharp breath. She needed to clear her head. She needed to forget. But as she walked down the empty hotel hallway, heels clicking against the marble, every step felt wrong, like she was leaving something unfinished, like she was walking away from something she shouldn't, and deep down, She knew this wasn't over, not even close, because Noah Sinclair was not the kind of man you could sleep with once and forget. He was the kind of man who got under your skin. And Eleanor? She was already too far gone. Eleanor had spent years building her career, building her reputation, building her walls. And in one night, Noah Sinclair had torn through them like they were nothing. She told herself it was just a mistake, that one night didn't change anything. But now she wasn't so sure, because Noah wasn't letting this go, and neither was her heart. Days passed, then weeks. Eleanor did everything she could to avoid him. Business meetings were strictly professional. Emails were cold and distant. Phone calls were short, clipped, emotionless. But Noah Sinclair was not a man who gave up easily. And when he finally cornered her in a conference room, his voice low, intense, filled with something raw. "You can lie to yourself, Eleanor, but don't lie to me." She clenched her jaw. "We agreed. It was a mistake," Noah exhaled, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "No, you agreed. I never did." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. But she couldn't. She wouldn't let herself fall. Not again. So she turned, hand on the door handle, whispering, "This isn't real, Noah." Silence. Then prove it." She froze. "Look me in the eye," Noah said, stepping closer. "Tell me that when I kissed you, you felt nothing. That when I touched you, it meant nothing." She opened her mouth, ready to say the words. But nothing came out, because it would be a lie. Noah's voice dropped lower, barely a whisper. "Tell me you don't love me, Eleanor." Her breath caught, because this was it. This was the moment. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to win, she wanted him. And so she did the only thing she could. She closed the distance, and she kissed him like her life depended on it. Because maybe it did. 1 year later. Santorini, Greece. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a breathtaking glow of orange, pink, and violet across the sky. The waves lapped gently against the pristine white cliffs, reflecting the fading light like liquid gold. Eleanor never thought she'd come back here. She stood on the deck of a private yacht, the salty breeze running through her hair as she gazed out at the endless sea. This place was supposed to be her escape, the place where she ran to forget. Her career, the expectations, and most of all, him. Noah, the only man she had ever loved in a way that defied logic, reason, and all the rules she had sworn to follow. She had told herself that time and distance would erase the memories. 1 year had passed. And yet, she still couldn't let go. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the storm brewing in her chest. "Didn't expect you to be so quiet." Her breath caught. That voice. Slowly, she turned around. Noah stood there, bathed in the golden hues of twilight. He looked exactly the same, self-assured, impossibly handsome, completely unshaken. But his eyes, they were different. There was no arrogance in them, no challenge, just raw, undeniable emotion. Some people enter your life like a storm, chaotic, unrelenting, impossible to contain. But sometimes storms are exactly what you need to find what matters most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more captivating stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Eleanor's place?